we need to bear in mind that social tenants have the lowest incomes, so why are they the ones that are fair game in this, really?
Hello and welcome to today's edition of Scottish Tenants News. We thought we'd have a discussion on this rent cap that was extended by the Scottish Government, and obviously to a great fanfare very recently. I think a couple of weeks ago, I saw myself a post from the Scottish Government pitching a tower block, talking about how great it was that the rent cap was being extended. So Stephanie Martin here, the chair of the Wyndford Residents Union, is here to discuss this today. Obviously a key interesting point in housing struggles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that the cap is only supposed to be affecting the private sector neglects the real situation that social housing's in at the moment, where it's not really a public sector per se, that it's still impacted by market pressures and by privatisation increasingly over time, and that we need to bear in mind that social tenants have the lowest incomes, so why are they the ones that are fair game in this, really? Yeah,
and I mean, bear in mind, of course, that the mode average wage in our largest city is less than the minimum wage at full-time pay.
Yeah, the majority of households, I think it was 3/4 last time I read, the majority of households that rent socially earn less than 20,000 a year, and that's the household income. So when we hear about price increases being balloted around our local area in Maryhill, different housing associations are looking at between 7 and 9%. That's going to be an incredible squeeze on a household income of less than 20,000 a year.
Yeah, I mean 9%. It's a hell of a thing, because food's going up, energy's going up. We all know about the energy battle, but
yeah.
I mean it's interesting the way that the government trailed this, because the pitch of the tower block are misleading. Yeah. Very few tower blocks are privately owned.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, there's something here to be said about the nature of public housing itself, because since the advent of the Scottish Parliament, we haven't really had subsidised rents. And the view of rents generally is that you're a social housing landlord and it's a social rent if it's up to 80% of the market rent. But in a city like Glasgow, the average rent is above £1,000.
Yeah.
So what would that mean for someone on those kind of budgets?
Yeah, well, it's devastating, really. I think a lot of people do get support to pay their rent through universal credit, but there is a cap to that level of support. And if your rent is too much, well, that's just too bad almost, is the situation people will be facing. It's not as if everyone is able to just change job into something that's a bit more well paid. And when the benefits aren't filling that shortfall, it's not even a choice between eating or eating anymore. It's like, how are you supposed to live at all? You don't have a roof over your head, you can't afford the food prices either at the moment. And then you hear all the time about the way food banks are struggling more than ever because they're just not getting the donations anymore because people can't afford to give.
Yeah. And of course we've got a tenants' rights minister who, this is the keynote policy, rights for tenants. But I mean, there really is something to be said about the fact that the social sector, the public sector, there are twice as many tenants in that sector, twice as many households.
Yeah. I think it's symbolic in a lot of the things that the Scottish Government have done, where it looks good on paper, it looks left wing, but it's not actually when you just scratch beneath the surface. For instance, I think the bus passes for under 22-year-olds comes across like a really good idea on the surface, but the hoops that these young people need to jump through for a start to get the bus passes, and then you think about, well, that's not actually matching up with the demographic who really need it. Mm-hmm. For instance, there's a lot of new arrivals in Scotland, asylum seekers and refugees who can't get a bus pass, and they're isolated. There's a lot of people on universal credit who can't afford a bus pass, and meanwhile all a universal policy that all under 22-year-olds get it. It just doesn't match up to the real need. And then this policy is very similar. It's going to benefit a very small demographic, and it's not the demographic who actually really need it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's also interesting as a mechanism, because clearly those who push for this have seen it as a way of bringing rents down. If you cap the rent below inflation, then hopefully pay rises will then go above the rents. But we've still got a situation where public sector housing, the rents have gone up above inflation more or less every year for nigh on 20 years. And that is the real pressure we could bring to bear on rents, the rent squeeze. If we were able to make it impossible to charge the kind of rents that are happening in the private sector. I mean, we're sat here in the Wyndford. In this very street, there is a house that's being let out for £2,100, turned into 4 box rooms. That house, if it was being let out by the Housing Association, would be under £500. Mm-hmm. So, if that Housing Association keeps chasing those high private sector rents up to the 80%, they're not so much depressing the rents as accelerating them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's the model, isn't it? It's the way that everything in the public sector is supposed to be led by the private sector. Like when we were talking about how an affordable rent is supposed to be 80% of the private rented sector. But that's still a lot of money. Like you were saying, if the average rent in Glasgow is over £1,000, I think that's, when you look at it, that's for like something like a 2-bedroom flat, or even a garden or anything like that, something very bog standard. 80% of that is unaffordable for people who are on an income of less than £20,000 a year. Yeah. And that's who we're talking about when they speak about social tenants. That's the majority of them.
Yeah, and it's related, but it's a similar, dissimilar, or that's quite a wrong way to phrase it. It's related, but different aspect of the economy to supply and demand. Mm-hmm. Because obviously if you increase the supply of cheaper housing, that will depress the rents. And, we've seen that with mass demolition, that destroying all these houses has raised the rent. But it's a kind of different thing. If you were able to depress public housing rents in the way that used to happen in the 1980s until Thatcher changed all that.
Mm-hmm. How would we be able to achieve that, though, like from our perspective as like community organisers?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting one, because you have this idea of the mid-market rent, don't you? That's also 80%. And there's this interesting ambiguity there, in that social housing can keep increasing in its rent up until it reaches 80% of whatever the market rent is, and it remains social housing. But mid-market rent, which is private sector rent really, that is 80% of the market rent as well, and they're both classes affordable, and that's the definition. And it's not based on any kind of ability to pay, or even the impact that has on the economy. It seems almost like an accelerant by deliberately choosing that 80% rather than another benchmark figure on affordability.
Yeah, or calculating what, I don't think benchmark figures is really the right way to go when it comes to calculating affordability, because it's not taking account of incomes, really. Yeah. And as an average of what the demographic is that's renting in that sector anyway. And it's an obvious issue that we've known for a long time, that there's a massive housing shortage in the social sector. And what is it now? We've got, I think, over 1,000 homeless people in Glasgow. And that's those without a home, that's not those that are in temporary accommodation. It goes even higher when you look at that. Yeah. So this is a real critical issue, and I think it's one that our campaign to save the high flats links in with really closely, because they are examples of very cheap to rent properties that are usually rented out to people that are quite vulnerable, relatively speaking. And to lose them is to lose a vital part of the housing market in Glasgow that is scarce enough as it is, and also has the effect, as you say, of putting the rents up overall. Yeah, and
social housing landlords are able to raise the rent by RPI, usually plus a percentage. So, we'd be looking at, I think that the figure that's been quoted in the press is 11.2%, but actually RPI at the moment is 13.4%. So there's no legal barrier to social housing just chasing the crazy inflation that we've got at the moment.
Yeah, there isn't, and we've seen that that's exactly what they are going to do. And we hear about apparently the energy bills are going to come down later this year. They probably aren't going to come down to what they were before all of this inflation. They're still going to be higher than they were. For most of us, wages haven't gone up.
Yeah, exactly.
We've heard about some great successes that the trade unions are achieving across different sectors, but it's not universal. Most people actually haven't achieved a pay increase yet. So this is almost like coming out like a side attack where the rents are going to be increasing, even though the bills might be coming back down again.
Yeah. I mean, there's that angle as well, that what happens when you are one of the 68% of social housing tenants who are in receipt of some form of housing benefit. What happens when you try to take on work? If all the work is poorly paid and part-time and your rent, you've got no hope of covering it.
Yeah, I mean, in my line of work, I work as a links worker in a GP practice. It's a common thing where people tell me that they're better off not working. There's no incentive for people to work because the wages are so low. They would either be the same income, but then they would need to pay childcare expenses, and you only get 85% of those back on universal credit, or they would be on less income if they were working. So like the rents going up is going to be another factor in that, because when you start to earn money, it comes off of your universal credit, whatever you earn. So it's certainly something that people are going to have to try and be clever about how they manage their household income, but only within a certain extent, because there's not really a lot you can do.
Exactly. And it's I mean, often it's looked at the other way round, that there's a tension between fighting rent increases and trade union organisation in housing, because most housing associations have a unite trade union representation, and obviously they're seeking the workers to do well. But the flip side is there's all these people who are caught in a poverty trap because of the way that for the past 20 years social housing has been viewed as an accelerant on the market rather than a depressor on the market. And if you look at the other way around, if we were to subsidise rents, find a way of subsidising rents, we could massively increase the power of trade unions. Yeah.
It was interesting to me to hear about. I think it's Unison represent a lot of weekly workers, housing officers and things, and that they were against the rent caps in the social sector because of this and how it would affect their incomes. So yeah, I totally agree with that about the tension that's happening there, and I don't really know myself. I believe you when you say that if we were able to cap the rents, it would actually have the opposite effect.
Well, if we got more people into work and those people are already organised into a collective organisation. And there's the other aspect of it, Stephanie, where obviously the people who are not in that 68%, they're getting hammered and hammered and hammered. And that's actually taking money out of the real economy. And I think there's a feeling among, it must be said, that sort of professional Hollywood, the kind of political classes, that social housing is free money from Westminster for housing, because the UK benefit system pays out housing benefit. And, there's a feeling that it's acceptable to just keep the rents going up and up and up. And it's not really a systems thinking.
No, it's very short-sighted, and again, it's this frivolity with the public purse, and as long as it benefits the private sector. And I think, did Glasgow City Council not underspend on their social housing budget just that last year there?
Yeah, the 22-23 budget, they were 11 million. They spent 11 million less than they were given.
Yeah, and at a time where the shortages that we were just discussing, as well as the conditions of the properties that people are living in at the moment, dampness is a real serious issue in Glasgow. And for a city that's notoriously bad for breathing problems, it's one of the biggest reasons people are using the NHS right now is lungs and breathing difficulties. So the dampness in the properties in Glasgow is a real issue, and the lack of infrastructure to properly insulate homes is a real issue, as well as the housing shortage.
But again, that comes back to the sort of systems thinking here, because the 20 or 22% rise in the number of dampness complaints is directly correlated to people not turning their heating on because they can't afford their heating.
Yeah.
But if you can't afford your heating, how can you afford your rent rise?
Exactly.
The whole thing is a system. So, in allowing public housing to chase the market that way, they've created all these other costs for the government, as well as societal negative impacts.
Yeah, it's all about like the direction of the wealth here is crucial because it's going up the way, clearly. The money that is being used to furnish the sort of private sector and the lavish lifestyles that a small part of society are able to live in is being directly siphoned away from those that are at the bottom end of the scale and the poorest among us. And it's just, like you say, it's about thinking about it systematically. How do we reverse that direction to make things a bit more egalitarian? Yeah,
we need to bring these costs in public housing down. And it's the biggest lever we have on the market. I mean, rent caps in the private sector, it's not a bad thing, but we know there's many loopholes. However, it's not going to address the fundamental problem that we need to decommodify housing.
Yeah, and people would prefer, those on low income would prefer to stay in the social sector, the public sector, because they know that there's more security in those homes. They're not, but it's much more difficult to be evicted, and also that they believe that the rents are cheaper. But it's almost like a trap there because it's more secure on one side of things, but it's less secure on the other because you don't really have a say over your rent. You get offered this rise or that rise, and both are bad options.
And of course, that's why we need to bring back democratic control of public housing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Bring public housing back into the public sector, get rid of those who are skimming on the public sector, and then obviously bring back the tenant management cooperatives and the letting agreements that used to be common right across the country.
Yeah. Recently, I had in my work a student shadowing me, and she came from Malaysia. She was telling me that what struck her about Glasgow is there's some amount of like multi-occupancy apartments, but they don't have any amenities on the complex. She was telling me about multi-storey buildings in Malaysia, how they had laundrettes and a gym and a pool and gardening sites for all the tenants located on site. None of that exists in multi-occupancy buildings in Glasgow. Most of it's being provided by the third sector, and it's a bit of a dispersed distance from the building. So it's the lifestyle, and it's what contributes, I think, largely to why we've got such a shorter life expectancy here than elsewhere. The quality of living isn't there at all either in social housing. It's very much a story of neglect, and it's decade-long neglect. There's so much more that we could do that would be more creative and more beneficial for ordinary people and actually life lengthening if we did have greater tenant involvement in the decision making right at the top when it comes to public housing.
And of course the Scottish Government's been informed in the rent cap and so on. There's changes to tenure in the private sector, changes to tenancy agreements and things. Informed by the situation in Germany, where they have a much more renting in the private sector and it's more regulated. But I would point instead to Vienna. I don't think we need to go as far as Malaysia. In Vienna they have a huge amount of public housing, and it's extremely well regarded. And for all the reasons you're talking about Malaysia, you only need to look at some of the schemes there, and people are dying to get them. Yeah.
And I wonder how much of that is to do with the democratic control of them.
Exactly. And you heard it here first. Democratic control, bring down the rents in public sector housing. The rent cap doesn't address the vast majority of tenants' needs. See you again soon.